Discussions of our current endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria in a lot of the media has a tendency to focus on the particularly high-tech nature of the weapons used. We have this idea, they're described as smart weapons, they're super accurate. Very rarely do we focus on the people. It's more on, man, we really have some amazing, accurate weapons. But some new reporting actually from the New York Times might lead you to believe that we were misled about how minimal the civilian casualties have been in those conflicts. And so I want to give credit to Azmat and Anand Gopal for their reporting here. But here are some numbers to consider. The coalition, this is particular to Iraq, has conducted more than 27,500 strikes to date, with everything from B-52s and to Predator drones. According to the coalition's available data, 89 of its more than 14,000 airstrikes in Iraq have resulted in civilian deaths.
This is since the beginning of the Iraq War, or since the beginning of the fight against ISIS?
For Iraq in particular, the 14,000 airstrikes?
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure about the timeline. I know that they've restricted it specifically there. I believe that it's capped out at the beginning is during the fight in ISIS. I don't believe it's from the beginning of the war, but feel free to check that. In any event, the comparison between the two is roughly likely to be as true if you extend it back farther. So that would amount to about 1 in every 157 strikes results in civilian deaths, which automatically, if you pay attention to the news, should probably be a little bit suspicious there. But the New York Times decided to send some of its reporters to the ground in Iraq to investigate some of these issues. Now, they're saying overall in the coalition, since August of 2014, it has killed tens of thousands of ISIS fighters and 466 civilians in Iraq. Okay, that's the sum total the coalition says has been killed, give or take a few. But to the New York Times, between April of 2016 and June of 2017, they visited the sites of nearly 150 airstrikes across northern Iraq, not long after ISIS was evicted from those locations. And then they did a variety of different ways of sort of gathering information, interviewing people, gathering intelligence on the ground, talking with some of the military in the region, examining bomb fragments, looking at local news sources, and those sorts of things. 1 in 5 of the coalition strikes they identified resulted in civilian death, a rate more than 31 times that acknowledged by the coalition. Now they're saying that it's likely that it's actually higher than that because of the difficulty of getting accurate information. But already, the difference between 1 in 5 and 1 in 157, that's not simply a different way of measuring it. That requires a great degree of willful ignorance and misleading of the public to imply that your weapons are that accurate against the eyewitness testimony of people in that region, those who have lost family members and friends in that region. Recently, there was video put up of a supposed bomb-making factory that was bombed. And the New York Times talked to the people who had lived in that building. They were civilian homes. It was not a factory. And that's just one of literally hundreds that have been identified as not being what the military has initially said they were when they were bombed.
I think if you were to extrapolate that from, what do we say, 466 civilians killed?
That's what the coalition is saying
right. So
during that period.
If they say 31 times more than that, or at least 31 times more, we killed civilians in a strike that we acknowledge, so it's possible that we've killed 31 times as many civilians as that.
Yeah. I mean, Air Wars says it's at least thousands in that region during this time.
15,000 if that were near it.
Potentially, Air Wars says lower, but they also say, again, it's so difficult to get accurate information. It's possible it's many times higher.
30 times 466. Is 13,980. So it's 14,000 civilians, not 466 civilians. And maybe that, I don't know that number is true either, but it suggests that we're looking at a 5-digit number or a high 4-digit number and not a mid 3-digit number.
Yeah, which both means that they are killing far, far more civilians than they've said, but also that they're killing far fewer ISIS members.
And we'll relate it back briefly to the last story because we don't even talk about it. I mean, we run into the same problem because it's so far out of the regular conversation that we have about taxes and tax cuts and funding the government. But, we just passed another military spending bill with huge Democratic support, right? And it didn't really even get debated.
Yeah.
We don't have a debate
Spending more than Trump had even requested.
Right, we just spend on these. We'll spend on what kills people. We will not spend on what saves people. And I'm not suggesting that we not have a military. I'd like us to get out of these wars. I think that overall, if we didn't participate in these wars, we would see a stunningly different kind of American foreign policy. There would be some downsides, no question. But the fact that we don't, as a country, think, what was the bill? Do you know off the top of your head what the military spending, what the authorization was?
644. Is that? What
I thought it was 700 billion.
yeah,
but
maybe it
somewhere
was
in
the
that
president
region.
asked for 644 and they gave him
possible.
700.
I thought it was 800, but maybe you guys will say 700 billion. What? I mean, that we don't even have a conversation of, what if we gave them 400 billion?
Yeah.
Right? And here's 425 billion to go around the world
How
every. And
crappy-
by the way, you'll get it again next year.
Yeah.
Right.
And by the way,
I'm not signing you to a 1-year contract.
we do this. We do this like every year. It's not like if you only spent $200 billion this year, then you've got a real crappy military.
look,
we already have all this stuff.
Right. We
Obviously, there's maintenance and pay and all of that.
We obviously, as a percentage of our whatever you call it, this is where I'm at, my gross
GDP.
national, I don't know.
Gross domestic
We
product.
spend more on the military than anybody else, and not just
Far,
because
far
we
more.
can, but we spend as a percentage, we spend more than anybody else, and we don't have a conversation about whether we need to.
Yeah.
That's marginalized to Barbara Lee, right? She's the person who talks about that, and like, oh, Barbara Lee, she voted against the war in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah.
We don't have a meaningful conversation among, and that when people who are to our left make that point, I find them to be 100% correct.
Mm-hmm.
They are just right as can be that somehow the Democratic Party has not at any point stood up in a meaningful way and the way the leadership of the party should have, the way you'd hope they would have, and questioned whether it's okay because they're afraid that they'll be called soft, and so or they believe it, or maybe they just
Right,
think they should spend
and
this money.
like more so even than guns or any of these lobbies, the raw facts of the way the House of Representatives is made up is that it's made up of people who represent districts,
Right.
Democrat and Republican, where the military is such a big part of the economy in their district.
And they've helped to create that in the military.
No,
by
they didn't help
purposefully
it. They
distributing.
created it.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
They
yeah.
did it
yeah.
with this goal in mind.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And
It was
a
a
lot of
successful-
people, like if you talk to regular people, man, they mostly think we should be spending more. They couldn't tell you if it's 700 billion a year or 100 billion a year, but they know it should be higher.
Yeah.
It's weird how that works out.
Should
and
build
so
a wall too.
We should. But I want to talk about, so we're talking about this increased civilian casualty rate, and here is a case study of how terrible this is, not just objectively, but directly in comparison to the ISIS occupation that had been ongoing in this area. During the 2 years that ISIS ruled downtown Qayyara, an area of about 1 square mile, there were 40 airstrikes, 13 of which killed 43 civilians, 19 men, 8 women, and 16 children. In the same period, according to the Iraqi Federal Police, ISIS executed 18 civilians. And so far more people were actually dying from the airstrikes than from the ISIS occupation. Now that doesn't mean that, of course, there aren't tons of other consequences of ISIS being in that area. But in sheer blood, our strikes were worse.
And let's be clear about what we're saying, because they're going to be, the clowns out there who listen to this show are going to suggest that we're equating the United States military and ISIS, right? And that we're worse, we're nearly 3 times more deadly than they are, which would appear in that town we are. The question is, what's the result? I mean, first of all, there's the ownership of that. What does it mean that we killed 43 people who were innocent, whose only crime was that they were terrorized by the most terrifying and awful people on the planet, right? Or among the most terrifying and awful people on the planet. And I mean ISIS, like that their lives were ruined by ISIS until we dropped a bomb on it and they thought, oh wait, it can get worse, right?
Yeah.
So we have to take ownership of that, and there's a moral responsibility there which we're not interested as a people to examine. But then, of course, what we talk about frequently, what we pay a price for that. There's a tangible effect that has. Like what, and do we spend a lot of time thinking about that? We spend a lot of time talking about it. I don't know that we spend a lot of time thinking, what does it mean? Because again, as we often say, those 43 people, they had 137 children, and some of them were children, of course, and they had wives, and they have uncles, and they have cousins, and those are all people who, many of whom now will hate America, right? And see America as a killer from the sky, right? I don't know what the solution is, but I know that we ought to be talking about that, and we ought to be talking about it in an incredibly meaningful way, in the same way that we ought to have meaningful conversations about what we spend on the military.
Yeah, I've said it before. I want to say it one more time. And it's a bizarre idea, and I'm willing to accept modifications to it. But I think, especially considering the fact that the Senate and the House look like they're not going to accomplish anything for the rest of until the midterms. So I think we can set aside 6 months where we have this is going to be the biggest thing like it in the history of our country. 6 months of hearings where the heads of the military and the corporations that supply it go in every day. It's on TV. And we go through on a map every single country where we have soldiers and bases, and the military makes the case for why we have to continue that. Then we go through the top 100 expenses of the military, the programs, the exercises, all of that. And they make the case directly to the American public why we need to be in these places and why we need to be funding these programs. Because as long as it's cloaked behind, and we're out there, we've got a lot of stuff, we need a lot of stuff, I don't think people really realize how big the numbers are. But when we're talking about why the hell do we have 700 soldiers in this African country nobody even knows exists? Why are we doing that? I think that we can afford to give a year to it.
3,000 and 5,000 on the British island of Diego Garcia off of Mauritius near Africa. I mean,
what percentage of the American public knows that?
Yeah, very, very few.
And they should know that.
At max, 2 of the 3 people at this table. I'll tell you that right now.
Right.
Anyway, I think that would be a great exercise for our country to finally spend a significant amount of time, both on the government side and our personal side in the media, coming to grips with the military empire that we have developed and whether certain parts of it could perhaps be curtailed.
Help us build independent media. Become a member of the Young Turks. TYTnetwork.com/join.